Our first speaker is Wade Baker. He comes to us from Virginia, from Verizon. He is the Director of Risk Intelligence for Verizon Business and has nearly 15 years of experience in the IT and security industries. Prior to his tenure at Verizon Business, Mr. Baker spent 5 years on the faculty of 2 major research universities, most recently in the Pamplin College of Business at Virginia Tech. He also ran a consulting firm providing IT services to companies and educational institutions. Baker has a bachelor's degree in business development and a master's degree in information technology from the University of Southern Mississippi. He is also in the final phase of obtaining his PhD in business information technology at Virginia Tech. Please welcome Mr. Baker.
Okay. Does the sound good, I suppose? All right, see some nods of heads there. So thank you very much for having me today. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you, and there's a little summary of what I'm going to be speaking about, looking at some of the trends. As Maria said, I work for Verizon Business on the risk intelligence team. Part of what we do is try to understand risk. So I'll be talking about some of the factors behind risk and trends and attacks that we're seeing. So hopefully you'll find it interesting. I want to start with some goals that I think doesn't matter who you are, you probably have if you're in the business of managing security, private, public, educational, whatever. You need to be secure. I have enough in parentheses there just because we all know that perfect security is a myth and you can't really have that. So we want to be secure enough. And it's not good enough just to be secure enough, if you could really be that way. You probably need some knowledge or you need to know that. Unless, if you don't know this, you'll keep spending money and you'll just be throwing money out the window. So that knowledge is important as well. And if you are secure and you know you're secure, but others demand that you prove something to them, offer them some form of accountability, and you can't do that, then that's still not good enough. So I think these 3 factors represent what's common to all of our missions with respect to managing information systems. So there are some constraints. There's constraints in everything that you do. People, skills, resources, money, time. All of these things work against our ability to accomplish those 3 goals. And then one that I'm particularly interested in is there's just a low quantity of data by which you can make security decisions. And I think that's been affecting our industry for quite a long time now. It seems to be a persistent problem. I haven't seen it solved. I've seen many solutions proposed. But it still sticks around. Every now and then there seems to be a resurgence of interest in this, and I've seen lots of governmental activity, and I hope one of these days these things will stick and we'll get over that hill and we'll begin to have more credible, quality data that we can use to actually make data-driven decisions. So this is just really the only slide about what I do with Verizon Business, and I just have it in here to give you a background on where some of this data that we're going to speak comes from. So risk intelligence, fairly simple diagram there. Collection, analysis, and distribution of anything that tells us about risk, about information risk, that is. And external, internal data, external being external to Verizon, so like any company is going to do threat and vulnerability analysis and things like of that nature. So internal from Verizon's products and services, actually most of the data that I will be using today to discuss comes directly from one of these services that Verizon offers, and we'll speak about that in a little bit. And products, personnel, and public are where we try to put this stuff, so a little bit more on that later. One more slide. Sorry, I lied there. One more slide on internal data. One of the things that I just want to plant this seed here because it's foundational to some of the topics that we'll be covering. And I just put it out there because maybe there's some other businesses who are thinking about this. I view my job at Verizon, I'm not really attributed to revenue creation. My business unit that's not how we're measured. Of course, Verizon wants to make revenue, money off its products and services, but my interest is in evaluating the capability of each product and service to contribute intelligence or data and also consume that data. So you have this knowledge informs practice, practice informs knowledge. It goes both ways. This is something that I think all organizations struggle with. I've seen several presentations that go something to the effect of, if we only knew what we knew. There's much more data potential in most organizations than is actually realized for other than what they're directly used for. So hopefully this is an example of where data is almost a byproduct of something that you already do, and you can make it useful. Recycle it, so to speak. So you all know this adage: if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. We can't hope to meet those 3 goals that we talked about. So here's something. I put this together. I don't know if you agree with it, but we're talking specifically about security beliefs here, okay? I don't want to get into all the other type things that we get into when we talk about beliefs, but I think this little summary is fairly true. That your results, let's call it of your security program, are based upon practices that you employ, and those practices are, at least to a certain extent, based upon what you believe to be true. You're not going to do things, you're probably not going to invest in security services that you do not believe are effective or you think they will fail. So I think that correlation between belief and practice exists. And then beliefs are, at least in an ideal world, based upon data. And therefore, one of the reasons I like data is that it has the power to change beliefs, and therefore practices, and therefore results. So that's the chain we're working with here. So I want to test this. I've done this a few times, and I get interesting results each time. So this is a diagram I got. The name is Edward Adelson. If you can't read it there, but maybe you can look up this diagram at the end of this if you want to see it. Show of hands, if I tell you that these 2 squares, A and B, are the exact same color, how many believe that? 2, 3, 4, something like that. So what about practices? If you really had to do this and you had to put a wager, $1,000, $1 million, I don't know, but you had to put a wager to back up your belief by practice, that those 2 squares are the same color, would anybody take that bet? Would your practice follow your belief there? So I have a few takers. So we'll try a little experiment here to see how belief changes as we go through. And I'm going to try to offer you more forms of evidence to convince you to change your beliefs. So the first one, I'll just claim those 2 squares are the same color. Anybody swayed by that compelling argument there? Not many more. Okay. So how about logic? The way this thing works is it's an optical illusion, and like all optical illusions, it tricks our eyes, and the green cylinder and the shadow field cast and the light background up here and the darker background here just tricks your eyes and makes you think that those 2 squares are not the same color when in fact they are. Anybody else convinced by that type of evidence that I've just offered you? Maybe some people, still not overwhelming sway of opinion here. How about experience? If I tell you that I've tested this, and I promise you that I had success, I found it to be true that they are the same color. Anybody swayed by that kind of evidence? Couple more people. All right. So measurement. This next slide, it's kind of grainy. I apologize for it, but what I'm doing, I'm just using an open source graphics program, and you know the color picker, how that works? Select a field, tells you what color. I'm going to do that in both squares, and that'll be our form of measuring this. If it decides to play. All right, I'm left hanging here. Guess there's nothing I can do about that. Okay, so that totally ruined that demonstration. I'm sorry, I tested it beforehand. It works. I'm not sure what's going on there. What you were supposed to see is the little hand going and picking both squares. They both end up, both of the, where you pick the colors, the foreground and background, end up the same color. So I can't ask you how many people were persuaded by that. But that's the way it's supposed to turn out, and everybody in the room is supposed to now believe it because I just gave a great demonstration based on backed up by measurement, right? Okay, so good. Wow, there we go. Actually, I've done this a few times now, and what ends up happening is people still don't believe it, honestly. I've seen it where everybody still thinks. And I always ask, well, either you don't believe me or the test. Maybe you think the program here, GIMP in this case, is just a terrible tool for measurement and it's wrong. Or there's something that you just refuse to let go of that belief. And I think actually all are pretty applicable for our field of information security. I have seen people that are presented with a great amount of data and evidence, and they just don't change their opinion. And I don't think there's anything that would cause them to change their opinion. I do think that we have a lot of pretty bad tests and pretty bad tools out there that we use, and we take a measurement, and we think that measurement is representative of everything, and so maybe we do change our beliefs. And it turns out that maybe we shouldn't have done that. Maybe we took that measurement to value to be too great. So anyway, that was a miserable failure. So I have to ask you, when you think about your security program, what forms the basis of your belief or your security doctrine or whatever you want to call it? Is it more claim-based, more logic-based, experience, measurement? I have a belief that there's very little actual measurement that is done that drives our security decision that we really use to manage our programs. Maybe in some cases there are. I think it's a lot of experience. I think we have best practices, and some people and they had good success with this control, or they're recommending this, and so you adopt it. I think there's a lot of that, a lot of logic, of course, and an awful lot of claims. I've done some work recently just on another side of Verizon where we have ICSA Labs as kind of an independent division, and they test basically vendor claims for security products. And the belief in claims is lowering as I see the results out of that. But anyway, that's a side point. So I get a lot of these kinds of arguments when I start talking about risk management based on data-driven risk management or risk assessment, if you will. Maybe you've used these, maybe you've heard these. I don't know what side of the fence you're on there, but I hear them all the time. And it basically, the repeating refrain I hear is that this is impossible, impractical, unknowable, unreliable, garbage in, garbage out, all of that kind of stuff. And what we're really talking about here is that there's a lot of uncertainty in our field, right? Uncertainty over which things we should be measuring and whether our measurements are good and what we should be doing and what forms good practices, sound practices, all of that. So I want to step out of the world of information security right now and step into something in organizational theory, where I find this theme of uncertainty has a lot of, they give it a lot of attention. And in organizational theory, uncertainty just means a lack of data or a low amount of quality data or usable data. And I think that's a problem that, I don't know if I'd call it the number one problem that afflicts information security, but I think it's top 5, top 10. For sure. And I think others realize this. I'm not going to read this whole quote, but it's one that came from President Obama recently that I found pretty interesting, and I'll just highlight the few red places there. This realization that uncertainty is one of the things that we need to overcome and battle in information security, I think, is gaining a wider acceptance. I think you'll hear a lot about this from Adam as he speaks later. His book deals a lot with it. So, need to investigate information security. We need to do this on a national level. We need to understand what happened to organizations that have a mistake so that others can learn by those mistakes. I find that to be a really interesting concept. It's one that we employed in the private sector. The data, again, that I'll talk about today comes from about 500-600 incidents where we did that investigation, and we're sharing with you what we learned, and hopefully you do find it that you can learn how to avoid these mistakes. I mean, that is a model that I believe in, and I hope it grows. So, but data is very helpful. but data just alone is less than optimal, it's suboptimal. So this little proverb here, without knowledge, there's no understanding. Without understanding, there's no knowledge. Data without a framework is a problem as well. So there's another term from organizational theory that I'll throw out there. I also think it affects the information security industry. And that word is equivocality, which it doesn't mean a lack of data, but it means a lack of understanding or meaning or a framework or a context for data. So you could have all the data in the world, but if you can't ascribe meaning to it or put it in a context, really no better off than you were before. And if you have a great framework with no data in it, what are you going to do with that? So these two things work hand in hand. Some people might be thinking, well, what are you talking about? We've been doing IT security for a long time now, and we have frameworks, and we have all of these things down, and we're good at this stuff, and we've been talking about it. We've solved all those kind of problems. All we need is to dump data in these models, and we're good to go. You know, I don't know if I agree with that, and I'll just maybe prove a point. This might fail miserably again. But if you've ever been asked, what are the top 10 threats facing information security? Any question along those lines? To that question, I've seen, not all at once necessarily, but I've seen all of these things on the screen proposed as the top 10 threats facing information security. Anybody see a problem? I didn't hear that. Yeah, there's more than 10. Good call. Yeah, that's, I can't count. It's just a problem of mine. I don't know. We'll get through it. Problem here, all these aren't threats. And I know that seems like I'm playing semantics or nitpicking or something, but I think this represents a problem. This is a mixture of threat agents or actors. It's a mixture of threats, of attacks, of weaknesses, of assets, of impacts, vulnerabilities, all of those kind of things, and those terms are important to the way we understand and manage risk. And to the extent that we just conflate all of these things, I think we lose our ability to manage somewhat. There is, in this report that I'll be discussing today, there's maybe you'll see some of this. There is a structure behind it. I won't spend too much time here. But for instance, when we look at an incident, we look at this incident and we're looking for, rather than there was an intrusion, a network intrusion, it's not descriptive enough. You know, we're looking for an agent. What source? Who did it? Was it an insider or was it an outsider? Some type of action. Was it, you know, what type of network intrusion was it? Was it malware or was it a physical type attack where they broke in a door? Asset, what asset was affected? And then the security property or attribute that was affected. So, you know, I consider a good, well-defined threat to have those four characteristics there. Agent, action, asset, and attribute. And you can see I have an example there. An internal privileged administrator abuses their system privileges and they compromise the confidentiality of a structured data repository. I can understand what's going on. Now there's more details that I could add to that, but it's got a framework, okay? And I just show you that to see as we go through the data, you'll be seeing that framework backed up with data and findings from what we're doing here. So organizational theory, back to that really quick. And then I'll actually get to probably the stuff you might want to hear about. I am proposing that our field of information security, this is a quadrant from a paper published years ago in Management Science, that organizations exist in these four quadrants with respect to their information sharing and these things. So I'm applying it to our industry or field of information security. I'm going to argue that we're in the top right, where we have high equivocality, high uncertainty. I think we have more uncertainty than we have equivocality, so we might be, say, I don't know, right in there, something along the line. But I think that's where we are. And we need to lower both of these things, okay? I just say that to say, you know, we can't just be about the business of collecting data. We need to enter into discussions about what things mean and frameworks and all of those still. We have some work to do there. Okay, so back to this slide. I'm not saying it again. I'm just saying that one of our mandates within Verizon is to publish this analysis that we do to the public. And we've done that over the past few years in the form of the Data Breach Investigations Report series. Maybe you've read these or heard of them. We have 5 years running of data. And there's the web address, but most of what I'm discussing today comes from these. I've actually kind of combined the data set for today's talk, whereas before you got 2004 through 2007 and then 2008 separated out. This is all 5 years of data from these reports, so you might see something a little bit different if you've already read the report and digested it there. So you can read these. They're free to download. Free. If you hear something interesting, you can probably learn about it more there. I'm also glad to take questions or anything like that. So let me tell you a little bit about the methodology so you at least know what we're working with here. Again, Verizon Business has an investigative response team. This is one of those products and services that they offer that I view as a data generating source. Okay? And we identified them several years back. And we said, when you really think about understanding and managing risk, they have the kind of data that we would be interested in. Verizon, of course, has network attack data and other things going on, but this was a specifically a very useful one in my mind because it's an after-the-fact view of what actually happened, and they work a lot of the major incidents. I would say that if you took the top 20 breaches that you've read about in the paper, I think we've done 75% of them or more. So the team does quite a lot, especially of the large-scale financial card data-related breaches. They've looked at that. So it's a very wealthful source of information. We did a collection analysis process. When we identified this data source, we said, well, what kind of data do they have? What can they offer? We created metrics for them. They implemented that into their standard operating procedure. And so these things are collected during or after an investigation, an actual investigation. It's not a survey or anything like that. These would be the primary investigator that did the case. They fill out these statistics and things that we're talking about today. And so from that perspective, I would say it's a fairly credible pool of data. These guys know what they're doing. They're trained. A lot of times they work with law enforcement, so if they lied about it, they'd kind of get in trouble. So we anonymized this, aggregated it. Again, it's 5 years of investigations. It's about 600 confirmed breaches. When I say breaches, that's probably one of those words that needs a little bit of explanation. I don't mean that we worked 400 lost laptops. To qualify and be in this data pool, there had to be an actual confirmed compromise. In other words, I would call the lost laptop data at risk rather than data compromise. It may be compromised, but it's not. And furthermore, those types of, we don't usually get called in to investigate those. There's no evidence there. It's usually system intrusion and things of that nature. So anyway, we're looking at a data set of 5 years, 600 breaches, and a lot of them you've either heard about or read about. Now, let me say that even though that sounds like a large sample, it's not a perfect sample. I would love to see this kind of analysis repeated elsewhere. If you divide the world of all breaches, I think there's some categorizations here that are helpful to understanding what we're looking at. There are known breaches and unknown breaches. This first vertical designation. That is not split in a representative fashion. I happen to think that unknown breaches are far more numerous than known breaches. And I do make that based on some evidence. We'll discuss that later. I don't think organizations are very good at discovering breaches, so that leads me to believe there's a lot of ones we don't know about out there. And then furthermore, if you take the ones that are known, some of them are reported and unreported. Our caseload is about half and half. I think last year we may have had more unreported breaches than reported breaches. It might be that they didn't need to be reported. There was no law requiring reporting. Or it may just be that the investigation is ongoing and so it hasn't been reported yet. But again, I don't know what that ratio is. Among investigated breaches, that would span reported and unreported. And this little red circle is us. I don't know how big that red circle is compared to everything. I just say that to say that we're looking at a sample. It's not a randomized sample here today. I don't make any claim that it is. I do think that it's, again, representative of large-scale corporate data breaches especially, and I hope everybody in the room has something to learn from all the other statistics. So without further ado, First thing you probably ask when you hear about a data breach is who did it? Any kind of crime is really, that's the point of, gosh, how many mystery crime scene investigation things can we have on TV? But they all want to know who did it, right? That's the thing. So in the world of data breaches, we've just divided this up into external, internal, and partner. I think external and internal are fairly self-explanatory. Partner is any other business, a third party that you have a business relationship with. So they might be a system administrator that you've outsourced to. There's several examples, hosting companies, all of those kind of things. And if you look at that, do these results surprise anyone? Counterintuitive. Got one surprise. All right, so nobody else is surprised. Great. No. I usually get some pushback here. This is one of those belief things where I think we've been conditioned. I'm not saying that my results disprove that. I'm just saying it's evidence in the direction that many breaches are coming from external sources. That's from my data source, what I can tell. I think a lot of people think internal should be at least higher than that. I've had some people tell me, slam their fists on the table, and say, we've always known that insiders are the highest risk. Furious. And I look at them and I say, I'm sorry, does that argue with that premise? Does that argue with that at all? I think it's an equivocality problem. I'm sorry to keep hearkening back to this, but I'm talking about likelihood here. This is frequency of occurrence. This is how many we see. This doesn't answer the question of who is the highest risk, right? Risk is likelihood and impact. So this is only one part of the story. So that's something that I hear, but in general, I do think that people think insider events are higher. I will talk more about this later. I think this might be confounded by some other factors, such as our ability to detect. But this trend has been pretty steady over time. There's the 5 years there. We've seen a little growth in partner-related breaches, and I think that has a lot to do with outsourcing and trends like that over the last few years. But another one, this third party, may be higher than you would think. I think this might be fairly descriptive of what's really going on here. Notice that in this is just whether or not that source or that agent had a role in the breach, okay? So it adds up to more than 100% because sometimes we have multiple agents or actors contributing to a breach. Sometimes that's collusion and they're both in it together to pull off a crime. Sometimes one party is not necessarily involved, which happens a lot, in fact, with partners. So a common scenario we see, external party compromises a partner, and then they use that partner's administrative connections to the victim, and the victim has no idea. It looks just like an administrator logging into the system to do their work, and that's particularly problematic for that reason. How do you stop it? It doesn't set off any kind of IDS alarms. It doesn't look weird in a log file. But it happens all the time. Partners, that's why this is different here, 9% versus 38%. Most of those partner things are of that variety, where the partner is not intentful or malicious in their actions. A few times they are, that's more like the 9%, but a fairly hefty slice of multiple sources. So this, again, different question here. Same thing, we're looking at sources still the same 3 sources, but this is the impact. I put impact in quotation marks because our investigative response team doesn't measure impact. We're not around 6 months, a year after the organization suffers the incident to ask them about all the various losses that they've had. We are there, we do the investigation, we go. So our measurement or metric of impact that we use is the size of the breach, how much data was lost. And when you look at that as your measure of impact, the typical insider breach is much larger. And I think that's kind of in line with what we would think beforehand. And so I think that's one of those things that maybe we get confused in our heads. Now, this is our best measure of risk. Total data lost over 5 years is that pie chart there. And when you look at that, it's pretty surprising. 82% of all records, and by records I could mean a card number, a social security number, a name, whatever it is, the sensitive data content that's compromised. Look at overall records, 82% from external sources. Quite interesting. If you looked at that, I would say that 90% of those are 5 breaches or less. So you have a real skewing of data here that makes that look different. Is something else to keep in mind. Okay, so again, next thing you would talk about on breaches, since we've covered the who, the actors by the title, is how are they doing this? What are the common methods that we see? How do people get into corporate systems, and what are they doing there? And in this world, we just use these 7 threat categories or action classes. There's types underneath that, and things get more specific. But at a roll-up level, these are split for various reasons that I won't go into here. But hacking, malware, misuse, physical, deceit. Deceit, by the way, is probably better known as social engineering, or something where deceit is used as the part of the attack rather than, say, an intrusion or something. Misuse is just any misuse of privileges or systems or access that you've been granted. All right. So even though something might be compromising a database through a network, the difference between hacking and misuse is in one case, that person does not have access to them, so they have to hack or intrude. They have to elevate their privileges or work around security controls or something. The attack looks different than if it's just misuse, where I'm the administrator, I log in, I get data, there's no controls in place for that because I'm authorized to do that. Okay, so error and environmental. Common question I get is, why is the error bar separated like this, where you have this little 3% dark spot and a long 62% gray bar? We're making a distinction between error as the direct cause of the incident. So hopefully nobody here has done this, but have you ever sent sensitive data to the wrong recipient in an email message? I'm sure you've sent email messages to the wrong person, but just imagine that you sent a bunch of sensitive information. That's a direct error that causes a data compromise. And an indirect would just be maybe you misconfigured a server or a firewall or all the various types of administrative and configuration procedural errors that contribute to a breach. So the gray is error is a significant contributor or factor in the breach, and the black is the direct cause of. Okay, so it's obvious that we see a lot of hacking and intrusion. I think that's pretty intuitive. By the way, I did forget to explain, the 60% is the percentage of breaches. So we had 600 breaches in this data set that we're looking at. So 60% of 600 involves some type of hacking. And the 82% is the percentage of data compromised or records. And this is about 600 million or more records over that 5-year period that we've investigated. So it's quite a large volume of data that was compromised. So 82% of those from some form of hacking. Okay, so physical, and you see this change. I don't have the slides here just because of the time limit on this talk, but if you switch company types or industries, you see a fairly dramatic change here. If you put financial organizations up there, all of a sudden deceit and misuse increase relative to hacking and malware. And I think that says something about the nature of attacks used against those types of organizations. And I think the nature of attacks used are dependent on the controls and protection measures in place. So a financial institution tends to be more hardened, and so a criminal wanting to access that data needs to revert to other measures. And the criminal is always doing some type of ROI analysis on the amount of effort it is going to take them to get to data. I often say that you can, a well-skilled, resourceful, funded criminal can probably breach any organization, but they can't breach all organizations, I think is a fairly true statement. And so you see them reverting to more costly forms of attacks with certain types of organizations. Whereas if you look on retail or food and beverage, it almost goes, all hacking and malware and everything else disappears because you can do fairly remote, automated attacks that are fairly simplistic in nature and get the data that you're looking for. So anyway, that's adaptive measures. Again, those comparisons are in some of those reports if you want to check that out further. Physical, deceit, all of those kind of things take longer. You have to show up on site. So from a criminal perspective, you don't see those used as often when you can access them through malware and hacking. So I want to take hacking and discuss it just a little bit. So we just said 60% of these things involve some form of hacking. Well, what type of hacking are we talking about here? What type of intrusion? It might be surprising for you to know that the number one cause here, or type, is just exploitation of default or shared credentials. This is, recent data. This is not early 90s or anything like that. Default credentials is still a major problem. Again, we tend to think of all these movie scenes, right, that we have in our heads of how data compromise works and how it's hanging in elevator shafts and hacking into street lights and all of that kind of craziness. Probably happens, but, they'd rather just walk in the door because you didn't change a password and they know what the default password is on that router or that firewall. It's a preferable method. So it's surprisingly common. SQL injection, again, that one's at least it's an attack, but it's a well-known attack, but responsible for a large proportion of the data that's been compromised over the last several years. Web applications in general, if you look up here, let's go back or forward. Web applications here, if you look at vectors, pretty common. Over a third of these take place through some form of the attack goes through a pathway through web applications. The other real common one is remote access and control. I think that's probably intuitive, but I think it's interesting. I would say that web applications get more focus these days. At least I read about them more as being we really need to secure web applications. Totally agree with that. But we certainly don't want to forget these kind of things that are dedicated toward management and they have root access on our systems and all of those kind of things. Network devices would include, networks, wireless LANs and all that. We've kind of seen that go down a little bit over time. I think this is one that's fairly surprising to a lot of people that see this. Only 16% of all of these breaches that involved hacking or intrusion exploited some type of patchable vulnerability. I'm using vulnerability in a narrow sense because any weakness in a system could be called a vulnerability, but I mean one that can be patched. Only 16%. And of those, 3/4 of them, the patch had been available for over a year. So I think this is pretty important when you think about how do we deploy patches. I see a lot of emphasis, we patch monthly now, that's our normal routine, and we need to move that faster. We got to get down to weekly. And in some cases that may be important, but I really think comprehensiveness is more important based on this data. What usually happens here is not that these organizations had patch cycles that were 2 years long. I don't think anybody has that, right? Nobody has 2-year patch cycles in the audience here? No? All right, good. These were just machines that someone forgot about because it was sitting over there and we had an organizational change and I thought you were managing that one and you thought I was managing it and it just slipped through and wasn't patched for 2 to 3 years and not really surprising that eventually it gets owned. So that's a fairly common way those things happen. So, all right, same thing, looking at malware. I think malware is one of the more interesting things that we've seen in the last few years. We see a lot more customization now, where criminals are targeting malware to specific targets. Hacking is kind of blah. It's not as interesting on the just typical breach. We see some very, very interesting things, very creative things. But overall, the real, where the engineering or innovation seems to be happening is in malware in a lot of these things. And malware is typically installed not by email or just a worm propagating through a network, but usually the criminal gains control of a system through some form of intrusion, and then they install whatever backdoor, keylogger, or whatever it is they need to use. We see a lot of SQL injection that's used to pull malware down to a system, and all kinds of innovative ways to getting. But it's more the criminal is getting that malware on there for a specific purpose. Tends to be more stealthy. They're trying to get it on there, increase their capabilities, and they don't want to be found for months, which usually happens, as we'll talk about in a little bit. Real quick on this slide. How difficult are these attacks? We have a rating system for difficulty. It's subjective, but everybody has the same definition. And pretty much the trend that you see are these attacks are not incredibly difficult, just on average. Most attacks still fall in the low to moderate category. I think that syncs with the rest of this data that you're seeing, where the number one type of intrusion is because of default credentials and whatnot. What is probably interesting is that over time, these highly difficult attacks are becoming more and more successful. I hate to use that word, but that's I think the right word to use. Whereas in 2008, 95% of 285 million records were compromised because of a relatively few highly targeted, very difficult attacks. And so, again, it's that payoff. Criminals will spend that time to do that if they think the payoff will be high enough. We see that over and over and over again. I think this, we put this together, and when we first started this analysis, there wasn't a lot out there just in terms of what data points can you collect from breach investigations. There's a lot out there from an evidence standpoint. What do you need to collect to preserve evidence and prosecute and all of that regarding cybercrime, but not a lot from I want to understand and manage risk. What could I gather that's helpful during an investigation? So a lot of these metrics we created, and this just happens to be one that we threw in there because we thought it might be interesting, and it turns out I think it's one of the most interesting things that this analysis uncovered. Personally, I was surprised probably more by this and the next slide than really anything else. 3 phases of attack. I don't think this is really how an attack plays out. We're forgetting several steps. I'm not covering any kind of reconnaissance or pre-attack activity, how long it took them to actually get through the perimeter, because again, we're working with evidence here. We're working with logs, and logs usually start from the time they're in the network. You have all of a sudden you have better data there by which to set these time bounds. So 3 phases. First one, point of entry. That's the time they get through the perimeter to when they compromise the data. And that usually takes days to hours. Does that feel long or short? It really depends. I've heard both interpretations there, and I think both are probably relevant. To me, it was kind of longer than I thought. I actually thought this offers a little bit of hope, especially when we think, we need to know when an attack is unfolding right now, and if we miss it within 5 minutes of when it happens, we're toast and we can just forget about it. These statistics actually say, if you miss it the first time, maybe if you did some batch processing at the end of a day and you got better at that, you missed it in real time, but you caught it at the end of the day or caught it during some relatively, some analysis that went shortly after that, you might actually catch the attack before compromise, before data was compromised. What they're doing, they get in your network, they're looking around trying to find the systems that they want to exploit. They're trying to find data. They have to figure out how to compromise data, so that usually takes some time. And they make a lot of noise, too, surprisingly. These victims don't tend to see it, but there's a lot of opportunity there as they're poking around on your networks to be looking for them doing that. The second phase is what I think is really interesting. On average, these 600 breaches, so 600 victims, months, I think it's about 5.5 to 6 months on average from the time data was compromised to the time the victim discovered the incident. And that's, it's probably, hopefully it's a little bit scary, hopefully it's shocking. I find it that way. It's not a very good picture, whereas the first one I think is maybe a little bit optimistic, this one not so much. And we'll get into how they discover it and a little bit beyond that in the next slide. But this is just an overwhelming problem, I think, with the state of our ability to detect and respond to breaches. So the last time phrase there has more about response. And again, you can see we're a little bit slow to react, right? These victims, takes them a little while. They discover the breach. They kind of try and figure out what to do. Are we really breached? Yes or no? What do we do now? I'm not sure. Go get the manual and see what we do. So a lot of policy problems here. I don't see a lot of rehearsing what to do. Nobody knows who to call. So that just extends this time period that data has already been going out the door for months. We tack on another week or two to that because we don't know how to respond efficiently. So breach discovery methods. Again, this follows right on. Remember that discovery happens in about 5 to 6 months in most organizations. And how is discovery made? 3/4 of the time, it's a third party that makes that discovery. So again, it takes bad news and piles more bad news on top of it. So this usually happens by third-party fraud detection. Again, a lot of these cases involved card data, and it turns out the best way to detect a breach is for the criminal to commit fraud on the data, using the data they stole. That's comforting, right? And I think that has, one, just for its value alone is an interesting statistic, but what's unsaid is probably even more interesting, and that means that if your most sensitive data type, or what you involve, or you would consider as precious data to you, is not card data, or it's not something that's likely to be used in fraud, you're far less likely to ever hear about it. So take the 5 months to 6 months that it usually takes for the credit card company to call you up and say, we're noticing a lot of fraud patterns. They point to you as the common point of purchase. You need to investigate this. Take that out of the picture, and 5 to 6 months goes to a year, 2 years for other data types, which is not good news again. So things that we create, active measures we have in place to detect incidents, IDS, log analysis, all of those things, 4% of those 600 breaches were discovered through those things. That doesn't mean those are terrible technologies. It means we're not using those technologies very well. Or at least it means that these victims weren't using those technologies very well. Turns out that I think the potential to discover a breach is far greater than the realized effectiveness of those things. When we do the investigation, we use the very same logs that these organizations missed. So we're reliant upon this evidence. We find it in about 75% of the time. We find evidence of the breach in log files that the victim could have found if they were looking in the right place. Now, I know hindsight is 20/20. We have a narrow field of where the breach took place. The organization has a different problem. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm just saying that it is this way. The only thing I'm going to call out about this is most of these things deal with online data. Again, this is a ROI from the criminal's perspective. If you're looking for a massive data compromise event and you want to take a lot of data, you're less likely to target one user's system than the repository where all of that system is aggregated, or the choke point where the data flows through. So over the years, we've seen a shift, interestingly enough, away from the distributed attacks on endpoints to where data is either aggregated in storage or aggregated in processing. And that probably syncs with some current events and news you hear about, but that I think that is a general trend for large-scale data breaches. Last slide, really, from data, and that is this one more thing that we find fairly uniform across all of these is we gave it this name of unknown unknown. We kept getting this repeating pattern of we would show up to investigate. Where did the breach happen? We don't know. Well, where is the data? Where does the data that was breached? Where is that on your network? And it's right over here. And so we investigate, no breach there, and we plug in, and within 5 minutes we realize that that data is always also over here, and turns out those systems are the ones that were breached. So this unknown data, unknown systems, privileges, connections, all of these things that the organization has lost track of. Again, I'm not saying it's negligence. I'm just saying you have thousands of systems to manage and monitor, and things kind of fall between the cracks. Happens over and over again. Criminals exploit those cracks. And so anything that you can do to plug those cracks, I think, is very, very helpful. I'm out of time, right? Okay, so I will just draw your attention to these slides. Maybe you'll see them later. Again, it's in the reports. But I've kind of summarized this, what we see across attacks and what we see across victims. And I think there's some lessons to be learned there as well, just drawing from all that. All right. So are we going to do questions, or did I talk through them?
Please go to the mic with your questions. Anything over email?
Brave soul.
Great presentation, Wade. It looks like you have a lot of experience in the financial sector with these breaches. I'm wondering what your take on compliance is versus security, things like PCI.
It's a mixed kind of love. I'm asked this question a lot, and I have to dance around certain issues because I'll just say, we do PCI auditing, not me, but part of our business. And so there's all of those factors. On just a personal level, I think of pretty much any compliance standard you draw up there. If you draw a circle around a bunch of controls, you're going to get some that are effective, and you're going to get some that probably aren't so effective, and you're going to miss some that should have in there. And I think no matter what industry you're in, financial, PCI, card data, even standards rather than regulations, I think that trend is fairly widespread. And so I know that's not directly answering your question, but I think there's value in them. I think we're missing in a lot of areas. Going back to measurement, I don't think we've done a good job at all in validating or vetting the things that we put in check marks of stone. So we get these things that we cling to and we enforce them. And a lot of times, they're hard to, you ask why is that effective, and there's really no answer there. And I think that's a problem. So I don't think anything is optimal, and I think we're missing in some areas. But overall, some are better than others, and we're trying to get there.
Wade? Just wondering, with the 80% of log files where you found evidence, are these usually log files where the attacker could have cleaned up, like a host machine that they had attacked, or is it usually network logs where they might have not had direct access to clean up? Is it laziness, or is it what's the breakdown?
It's both. A statistic that I did not show was that we see a growing trend of anti-forensics where they are deleting logs and modifying them and those kind of things. So we find, I can't remember the exact order, but a lot of evidence is in application logs, a lot of network logs, and probably number one is system logs. And sometimes they do have access. We're not really sure why they didn't try to clean them up. Sometimes you definitely see a difference in the skill level of the criminals involved. Some of them are, you can tell it would not occur to them to cover their tracks. And then some are very, very good at it, and all evidence is pretty much ruined. So, and I don't see a trend necessarily. I would say that's probably done more in system logs where they're cleaning up their tracks and whatnot. Yeah, and we've had a few cases where all evidence has been cleaned, and we've reverted to other sources of evidence and set traps and et cetera, and that that's helped when evidence is gone.
Hi, it's wonderful that you have this extensive procedure at Verizon. Just curious if, in order to increase consumer confidence and stuff like that for their online experience, you've had some breaches with web apps, of course. Do you have like a code review or auditing procedure in-house that you go by for these things, or like for the malware? What are the practices that you follow internally, for example?
Well, I am not on Verizon's internal security team, so yes, they do code review. I've stood up a few websites, and they always have to get scanned and whatnot. But there are a few recommendations at the end of these slides. Sorry, I didn't get enough time there, and there's some recommendations in the reports. But overall, we've taken web applications, obviously a problem, like you mentioned. A lot of that is, it's obvious that they're not doing any kind of code review or input validation, and that's the problem there. And so, if I had to line up effective practices, I honestly think number one is just the simple auditing. I know auditing is boring, but I can't help but draw that conclusion from the data that we just went to, where things like default passwords and all of that are the common way that criminals are in the door. So we know how to do this stuff. We have policies. We're not following through on the policies. Seems to be the number one problem. So anything I can do to make sure that my policies are implemented consistently and don't waver, eliminating defects and variation, et cetera, I think is extremely effective, whatever that is. And a close, I don't know if it's second, but top 5 is certainly, involves web applications, because they're involved in many of the larger data breaches. All right. Thank you very much. Appreciate it.